You know that feeling when your phone buzzes with another group invitation and instead of excitement, you feel drained? Like you'd rather spend Saturday reorganizing your bookshelf than sitting at brunch making small talk about nothing that actually matters. For years, I thought something was wrong with me for feeling this way, until I discovered what psychologists have been quietly documenting for decades about people who genuinely prefer smaller social circles or even solitude itself. Here's what makes this fascinating. According to research from the University of Chicago, we need to distinguish between two completely different experiences that our culture constantly conflates. There's loneliness, which is that painful, distressing feeling that your social needs aren't being met, and then there's chosen solitude, which is something else entirely. You can live a relatively solitary life and feel completely content, or you can be surrounded by dozens of people at parties every weekend and feel profoundly lonely anyway. The difference isn't about how many friends you have, it's about whether the connections you do have actually align with what you need emotionally. Think about that person you know who has 3 close friends they've had since college versus someone else with 800 Instagram followers who still feels empty inside. The UCLA Loneliness Scale measures this with questions like, "I feel isolated," or "There are people I can talk to," and what researchers found is that people can give completely opposite answers while having similar-sized social networks. What we're really measuring isn't quantity, we're actually measuring the quality of feeling seen, understood, and valued. Now, to where it gets psychologically interesting and, honestly, a bit counterintuitive, look, people who prefer a smaller circle of friends aren't running away from connection or anything, they're just chasing something a bit more meaningful. Seriously, if you look at personality research, the folks who are cool with solitude usually have their act together when it comes to self-awareness, emotional independence, and yeah, that fancy term intrinsic motivation. Basically, they do stuff because it matters to them, not because they're trying to impress anyone. Don't get it twisted, these people aren't flawed in any way. They just have an inner life so rich that needing approval from everyone else, it's not a priority anymore. Honestly, I spent most of my 20s convinced I was broken or needed some kind of upgrade. Like, why couldn't I be that person who's a rock star at networking mixers or those chaotic dinner parties where everyone's talking over each other? But here's the wild thing. The actual science says people who are fine with solitude have something a lot of people don't. They can just sit there with their own thoughts. No panic, no desperate scramble for their phone or another person to fill the silence. Psychologists call it emotional self-regulation, basically being able to handle your own feelings without constantly handing that job off to someone else. And hey, before you roll your eyes and think, wow, that sounds lonely, just hang on a sec. Studies on social isolation and loneliness have found that people who are okay with being alone usually end up with deeper, more legitimate relationships than those who can't stand being by themselves. You know why? Because when they do reach out, it's from a place of being whole, not out of some desperate need to fill a void. It completely flips the script. They put whatever social energy they've got into the people who actually matter, people who get them, respect their boundaries, and don't expect them to put on some fake persona. Quality over quantity isn't just a bumper sticker. It's straight up survival for your mental health in a world that's always screaming at you to be on 24/7. Here's something I found particularly striking when I dove into the academic literature. According to studies on aging with over 30,000 participants, researchers identified people who were socially isolated but reported low loneliness. These individuals had small social networks yet weren't suffering. Sometimes they were functioning better than people with large social circles who still felt disconnected. What this tells us is that the human need for connection is deeply personal and variable, and having only a handful of close relationships isn't a deficit, it's a legitimate personality orientation. Now, let's talk about the creativity piece, because this is where the data gets compelling. Einstein once said that the monotony and solitude of a quiet life stimulates the creative mind, and modern neuroscience backs this up. When you're not constantly processing social stimulation, reading faces, managing group dynamics, performing expected social scripts, your brain has bandwidth to enter what psychologists call divergent thinking mode. This is the mental state where you can explore multiple solutions, make unusual connections, and generate original ideas without pressure to conform to groupthink. People with few friends aren't missing out on inspiration, they're creating space for it. And honestly, here's something we rarely talk about but desperately need to. Having few friends doesn't automatically mean you're lonely, but it also doesn't mean you're immune to the psychological risks of isolation. Research from the National Institute on Aging has documented that chronic perceived isolation, that feeling of being alone in the world regardless of how many people are physically around you, affects attention, cognition, and behavior in ways that can genuinely impact long-term health. Studies have even linked persistent loneliness to cognitive decline and cardiovascular problems over decades. So the question isn't how many friends do you have, the real question is, do you feel connected to the people in your life, and does your current social setup align with what you actually need? Because here's what the psychological research reveals when you strip away all the cultural noise about what friendship should look like. People who thrive with fewer friendships tend to share certain traits. They have strong internal compasses, they're comfortable with introspection, they've developed what's called self-concept clarity, meaning they know who they are without needing constant feedback from others. They're not afraid of their own company because they've learned that solitude isn't emptiness, it's space. Space to think, create, process emotions, and develop ideas that matter to them. This doesn't mean they never experience loneliness. It means they've learned to distinguish between the temporary discomfort of being alone and the chronic pain of feeling unseen even when surrounded by others. If you're someone who's always felt slightly out of step with the cultural mandate to have large friend groups and packed social calendars, psychology actually has some validating news for you. Research on people who prefer solitude consistently finds they demonstrate higher levels of psychological adjustment, stronger boundaries, and greater emotional resilience than the general population. They're not deficient in social skills. Often they're quite emotionally intelligent precisely because they spend time reflecting on relationships rather than just accumulating them. The trap we fall into is assuming everyone needs the same social diet. Some people genuinely need daily interaction with multiple friends to feel alive and energized. Others need 1 or 2 deep connections and lots of alone time to process, create, and recharge. Neither is wrong, neither is healthier. They're just different psychological profiles shaped by personality, upbringing, and neurobiology. What matters, according to the research, is alignment. Does your life match what you actually need, or are you forcing yourself into a social mold that leaves you feeling drained and inauthentic? Because at the end of the day, the psychology of people with few friends isn't really about friendship at all. It's about understanding that human connection exists on a spectrum, and that your place on that spectrum deserves to be honored rather than pathologized. The person with 2 close friends and a rich internal life isn't failing. The person with 50 acquaintances and no one to call at 2 a.m. isn't winning. We're all just trying to find the configuration of connection and solitude that lets us be most fully ourselves. And sometimes that means choosing the quiet even when the world keeps telling you to choose the crowd. If this hit home for you, please subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button to become a channel member. I would genuinely appreciate your support.